Reddit, what's your family's dark secret? NSFW. My mother was a groupie for Creedence Clearwater. There's 5 kids in my family and none of know who my older sister's biological father is. We all like to speculate about it except for my mother and older sister. Before the days of Ancestry, Com and whatnot, my cousin and his wife went to Ireland with idyllic intentions of tracing our family heritage. They never spoke of it again, until years later when they admitted it repeatedly dead-ended at mental hospitals and jails, and they got so discouraged they quit. My grandparents swapped spouses. My grandmother on my mother's side had an affair with my grandfather on my father's side. Everyone got divorced, and then my grandfather on my mother's side fell in love and married my grandmother on my father's side. Family reunions were fun. My great-great-grandma went out to dinner with her husband one night. Her husband thought she was looking at other guys and brought her to a hotel room nearby and slit her throat. He left her to die, but she survived and then escaped and left him. We didn't find this out until a few years ago through an old newspaper. My mom was raped when she was 14. Her dad, my granddad, tracked the guy down and shot him dead in a bar. My uncle, the Protestant minister, was doing wealth management on the side, turned out to be other people's wealth into his pockets, got caught, and killed himself before they arrested him. Turns out my grandfather had been molesting my aunts as kids and other female cousins of mine. Finally one of them mentioned it to her husband and he called him and said, either turn yourself in or I'm calling the cops or something similar. Now my grandpa is in prison. Totally out of nowhere for me too. He also said that if more victims came forward he wouldn't deny it. Mostly pissed that if you really think about it he got away with it. He's in prison now, sure, but he was already dying. So just now on his deathbed he finally goes to prison for what he did. Also pissed that no one in my family seems to care and they're all trying to make excuses for him. My great-great-grandfather once got into a fight at a bar over a woman and murdered a man in said fight. It being the late 1800s, he moved a couple states south and changed his surname, which is how a family of European Spanish mutts ended up with a Scottish surname. My dad's family is messed up. His cousin told her husband that if he didn't stop smoking she'd divorce him. So instead of quitting he lied about having cancer. When he went to the hospital he told her he was getting treatment but instead smoked at the hospital. This all happened before I was born, but yeah, her husband lied about having cancer for almost a decade. My dad is the only normal one in the family. One of my aunties was a very ill woman, like oxygen to get out of the chair. Going upstairs is a one-a-week thing if lucky. Her son is a prick. When she refused to pay his drug debt off for the nth time because she had no more money, he poured petrol all over the house and threatened to burn her to death. The fumes were enough for her to pass out. He panicked, took a handful of pills, then panicked at that decision and called himself an ambulance. Didn't even mention his mum. Police turned up with the paramedics, arrested him and took her in the ambulance. I disowned him instantly. My uncle was apparently in prison for a couple years for sexual assault. No one ever spoke of it and I didn't find out until after he suddenly died years later. He suffered from schizophrenia, and when his wife left him after years of refusing treatment, he wandered off into the woods and froze to death. Now we don't talk about either of those things. Edit. Oh, and my father only has one testicle. The other one never descended, and my grandma either didn't notice or was too embarrassed to take him to see a doctor about it. My family was smuggling diamonds in the Apeldoorn area of the Netherlands from the late 1800s up until World War II. They got pretty rich off it too until the Nazis invaded and took most of them into concentration camps. My great-grandfather, while on the trains to a camp, convinced himself and several others to jump from the trains. As they did, they were gunned down by Nazi soldiers, and my great-grandfather was one of the only survivors. My mom's parents were uncle and niece. Her dad married his brother's daughter. Their family was on the East Coast and they ran away together to California. They had 2 kids, my mom and her older brother. All of us are a product of incest. My grandfather's uncle fell in love with an underage girl. He got drafted into the war and had to leave. When he came home he found out she had died. He dug up her grave and kept her dead body in his bathtub. We just don't talk about it, and I've never met that side of my family. Edit. First off, holy shit, I did not expect my comment to take off as much as it did. I went to bed and woke up this morning to a million emails. Secondly, I called my mom to see if I could get some answers to all of your questions. Turns out the guy was actually my grandmother's cousin. He was a Marine in the Korean War. Apparently when he got back he was told she had died. My mom has no idea how old she was or what she died of. He became so distraught he went and dug up her grave, put her in his bathtub, and kept trying to revive her. He was discovered only a couple days later. My mom says it was a small town, and once her freshly dug up grave was discovered they just put 2 and 2 together. No one talks about it. Only my mom, obviously. My dad is abusive and keeps my mother in debt so she can't take us and leave. We look like a perfect middle-class family from the outside, but boy is it shit on the inside. I don't really think that this is a dark secret, but it's something that I didn't find out until I was an adult, which was mostly because my grandma doesn't like talking about it, so I think it counts. When I was going through some old stuff of my grandma's after the death of my mother, I found some old photographs of a baby, not my mom because my mom had dark, almost black, hair at birth and this baby was blonde, and a birth certificate for someone named Francesco, mom's maiden name. I asked my grandma about it, and at first she didn't really want to tell me, but I gave her some space and she must have decided that I deserved to know, or maybe she was just tired of having the secret, because she eventually told me. Francesco, who they called Frank, was my grandma's son. He was my mom's younger brother by a couple of years. Apparently, when Frank was 3, my grandma's ex-husband kidnapped him and my grandma never saw him again. My grandma's ex-husband, my grandfather, although I don't consider him such, the least reason for which is because I never met him, was involved with the mob, and it's suspected that he took Frank with him back to Sicily, but nobody is really sure. My grandma is pretty sure that he would have taken my mom too, if my mom hadn't been sick and in the hospital due to tonsillitis at the time. It's kind of given me an idea of why that side of my family can be kind of withholding about things. I didn't know my mom had been married before my dad until I was a teenager, but it also makes me feel really, really sorry for my grandma. My grandfather died in 1946, before my dad was even born. We were always told he drove his truck into a ditch while drunk, fell asleep, and asphyxiated when the tailpipe got clogged with mud. He was in his early 30s at the time. Well, I got into genealogy a couple of years back and found a bunch of records and newspaper articles about the incident. Turns out Grandpa wasn't alone in the truck. He was with an underage girl, less than half his age, who also died alongside him. Obviously, this was not my grandmother. The newspapers didn't say it explicitly, but there was heavy insinuation that there was some side of the road romance happening when the fumes apparently overtook both of them. I still haven't told my dad what I found. Not sure I ever will. My uncle was investigated for the Green River killings. Years later he was investigated for the Spokane prostitute murders. He was good friends with Yates, who was found guilty, and his saliva was found on a beer can near a dumping site. When I was a little girl, my mom told me to never get in his car if he tried to pick me up. Funny enough, he sells life insurance. My granddad was into dating students before it became something people lost their job over. That's how our family got started. He taught, then gave extra credit to my grandmother. My great-grandma claimed for a long while that she was a virgin, which was why she adopted my grandmother, but I later found out that she had multiple miscarriages. I'd if that qualifies as dark, but it's definitely sad. Rip great-grandma. My grandfather raped and abused my mom and my uncle through their childhood. My grandma covered it all up and he never went to jail. They live next door to us. Birth mum was a prostitute. Adoptive mum tried to kill my dad with rat poison. Grandmother was a thief, her brother was killed by their father. My grandpa killed himself when my mom was very young. Her alcoholic mother decided making her 5/6-year-old. My mom helped clean the blood and brains off the wall was a good idea, and giving her a beer for helping even better. Great-grandmother ran a brothel. Great-grandfather was murdered by brothers who decided they were both in love with my great-grandmother. Great-grandfather was in the KKK. The KKK was quoted in the newspaper as saying something like, "We take care of our own." The brothers were never seen or heard from again. Edit: brothers were two siblings, unrelated to my family, and not members of the KKK. I don't know how they planned to divide time with great-grandmother. Also, when my grandfather helped lay out my great-grandfather for burial, 9 bullets fell out of my great-grandfather. My dad's brother is a pedophilic sex offender, was caught with over 52,000 images of CP on his computer, as well as bragging about abusing children as young as 5. As far as I know, only my mother and I, possibly my stepfather but I'm not sure, know that my real father wasn't some guy my mom dated in college but a stranger who grabbed her and assaulted her. I didn't even know this until she told me when I was a teenager. I am distantly related to the Unabomber. My grandfather's dad tried to join the Nazis, but his family moved him to Canada to prevent it. Edit: an apostrophe. Also, I put my grandfather's dad instead of great-grandfather because there's no blood relation. My mother was adopted, and we never met him. Only info I've gotten is from my grandfather. My grandfather went away to fight in Vietnam, and when he came back my grandma was pregnant with my mom. We never knew who her real dad was. A super distant uncle in my family used to get in a lot of trouble with cops. My nan and great aunt used to hide him, once hiding him in a freezer while cops searched the house. One day he ended up kidnapping an ambassador, successfully ransomed him off, tried escaping the country via boat, but the captain realized he was a crook and tried to take him to the cops. Distant uncle instead holds captain at gunpoint, and dives off the boat several kilometers off land. Police never found him and assumed he drowned. Decades later my nan got a letter from him, confirming to all of us he was alive and well. My great-aunt had a second child and gave it up for adoption because she was a newly single woman and didn't think she could provide for both kids. This apparently caused a lot of drama in our family back in the 70s, and people stopped talking to each other over it. My generation never heard a single word of any of this. Then, one day, my mom calls me to tell me about my new cousin. I was baffled and figured someone had a kid. Nope. That little girl that was given up for adoption was now in her 40s and hired a private investigator to find her biological family. She's since been assimilated into the family and I see her regularly at family events. My grandma's ex-boyfriend got put in jail for murder BC. He killed a dude that also liked her. Also, she and my granddad would have quickies during TV commercial breaks. My great-grandfather was a Christian Scientist minister. They believe that the mind can cure body, and he told the family of a girl with diabetes, a treatable disease, to pray the sickness away. The girl soon died and the girl's father killed my great-grandfather in a murderous rage. Grandfather tried to axe murder my dad. Cousin is a porn star by this time. I'm sure you've heard this all before. My great-grandmother was married to her first husband, an Italian mobster in New York, in the early 1920s. They had 4 kids. In 1928, 6 years after they were married, she disappeared and no one in the family knew what happened to her. They all quietly assumed her husband had her killed, as it was known he was very abusive to her. Nope. She ran off with my great-grandfather. They moved to Philadelphia and had changed their last names. They were always very secretive about their past. No one knew the original family names or where they had come from. Until I took a DNA test and matched with a third cousin that was descended from her first set of children. Her original 4 children were sent to orphanages because the first husband couldn't take care of them. It was a big surprise for both families and some very hurt feelings for the children she had abandoned. They are in their 90s, but it affected them their entire lives. I've told this story on here before. My mom's relationship with my dad was following a divorce. She had 2 kids with her first husband, a son and daughter. When she started dating my dad, as she was pregnant with my older sister, my dad molested my oldest sister. As soon as it happened, she found out about it. He tearfully confessed when confronted, told her he was sorry, and begged for forgiveness. She forgave him. He kept molesting my sister. Had my mom done the right thing, had she called the cops or even just left him, I would never have been born. Instead, I was the product of a child molester with an anger management issue, who tormented and terrorized my family until my mom left him when I was 7. My oldest sister is broken. She's got borderline personality disorder, or perhaps narcissism. She has never had a healthy relationship with another human being. She is abusive of her siblings and none of us have a real relationship with her. I found all this out 17 years ago. It's weird to consider that I shouldn't exist, that I shouldn't be here, but it doesn't trouble me. I try to be a good person. I'm definitely not my dad. Edited to add, well, this blew up. I definitely wasn't expecting that. Thanks, kind stranger, for the gold. To add a bit of context, surprisingly, only one person even asked, no, my oldest sister is not my mom. She was only 7 or 8 when I was born. For the people offering support, thank you, but I'm good. I'm a happy person. I sometimes have anxiety, but it's mostly related to the state of the world we live in, not my family background. I work in education. I'm more than aware of the statistical improbability of any individual's existence. That I shouldn't exist if my mom had exercised good judgment doesn't affect me. I'm here, so I try to be good. Everyone should try to be good, regardless of the circumstances of their birth. I'll add one story about my family that doesn't really change anything, but maybe it will give some of you the illusion of resolution. When I got married, my sisters were the maids of honor for my wife. My brother was our photographer. As we were ramping up to the wedding, my oldest sister began acting erratic. She got into a fight with my brother, typical, and laid down an ultimatum, it was him or her. She did the same thing with my dad. She didn't want to be in the same place as him. So I called her up and we had a talk. I basically spelled it out for her. This was my wedding, it was going to play out the way I wanted, and she was not to make any ultimatums. If she said it was either her or my brother, then she'd be out. It's that simple. When I told her that, she immediately dropped her protests of my brother's presence, because, going back to a point I made in one of the other comments, I'm not in a position where she can hurt me emotionally anymore. I don't put up with her shit. But as far as her ultimatum about my dad, well, him being at my wedding, and her bailing on it because he was there, felt too much to me like an example of the bad guys winning. I told her that I had no problem disinviting him from the wedding, and that's exactly what happened. From that point, on occasion, when I'd see him he'd complain about it, and when he did, I basically said, you're lucky we have any kind of relationship at all, because you don't deserve one. I wouldn't push it if I were you. And he dropped it. That was that. My dad basically took a life and wrecked it. He should have no reward for that. And the person with the wrecked life, she's now in her 40s. I know, factually, that people can get help for their problems. If she ever does that, I'll be there for her, but I can't force her to do it. Maybe someday, in time, but I'm not counting on it. My grandmother had an affair with my aunt's high school boyfriend's father. It became very awkward when my aunt married said boyfriend, and had a kid with him. Why? Because my grandmother married said boyfriend's father. My aunt now has a kid with her stepbrother. On my father's side, my grandfather and my father are both guilty of incest rape. My father is the only one who has been found out though. He took a deal to register as a sex offender, only because my little brother and sister were about to testify about what he did to them. The family still defended him, their precious boy, and they shunned my aunt for believing her own daughter, when she outcried that he had raped her. I of course do not keep in touch. But he is now with a woman, who's completely brainwashed that he is innocent, with a young, 6/7 year daughter. Poor child. Found out when I was a teenager that my mom had an affair with my dad's brother and that my brother and I might not be my dad's biological kids. Edit, just to clarify. It was rough for a long time and parts of my family are broken, but I love my mom and dad, mistakes and all. My wife's uncle murdered and buried his drug dealer down by a creek over $37 worth of drugs. He then got a job on the ranch with the creek so he could keep a better eye on the burial site, eventually owning the piece of land and making it completely private. Serial cheaters. 1 RST grandfather made a lot of children, 12 for sure, in the same neighborhood mom grew up. Second grandfather made a lot of children, 14 for sure, with underage girls in the same neighborhood. Dad grew up. 1 RST grandmother had multiple lovers at the school she worked. Many of my aunts and uncles are suspected half-brothers and half-sisters. 2 ND grandmother had a 20 years affair with her husband brother. Many of my aunts and uncles are suspected half-brothers and half-sisters. In addition of being cousins, almost all of my aunts and uncles divorced because of cheating and the ones still married are cheaters. Dad had a 30 years affair with his first love until his death. I have a half-sister and a half-brother. Mom cheated a lot on my father during the 90s. I made a DNA test to make sure he was my father. He is, after I read her last will and testament, accidentally, and knows she believes my little brother and I are the children of one of her lovers. I never told my brother, prays he is not my half-brother and hopes my mother lives a long life before he has to doubt we are not especially handsome or seductive in the family, so this was a shock when I learned about the cheating tendencies in the family. I don't want to end up cheating like them. Fun fact, a very nice girl I meet when I was in high school turned out to be one of my aunt. Nothing happened, but before I knew I wished. One of my cousins fondled another cousin when the latter was only 2 years old. I refused to acknowledge the pedo's existence. Edit, since multiple people are asking, the offender was 14 at the time. My grandfather broke it off with his first wife because she got knocked up by my grandfather's brother, who was/is also married, while my grandfather was deployed during the Malayan emergency. He had stress and anxiety issues the entire time I knew him, and I know it cost a part of himself to forgive his brother to keep the family together. The worst part? She named the kid after my grandfather. Tried to pass him off as a junior. The kid is now in his 50s and is in prison, selling prison art. Grandparents on my stepmother's side paid a hitman to take out my father. Luckily the guy had morals. He met my father and after talking to him a bit ended up telling him what he was originally there for and that he was going to return the money. I learned this Christmas that my great-grandfather belonged to the Ideal Club. They harassed and murdered local Puerto Ricans. My grandfather was raised in a home loaded with guns that was protected by multiple guard dogs. My grandma told me she was informed by her grandpa's mom, that her Phil killed 22 men. She also mentioned that those were just the ones she knew about and there were probably more. My grandma even dug out old pics from the 30s to prove it because we didn't believe her. Edit, to clarify, this was not a white supremacy group. He was a Mexican immigrant and everyone in his club was too. Edit, for images, https://imager.com/a/q9 latic. First one is my grandpa with one of the dogs. Grandma said they had 3 or 4 around the property. Second one is the man himself and the family. Third is the club photo with all of the members. My paternal grandma got pregnant with my dad when she was something like 17 in a small town in northern Louisiana. She claimed my grandpa was abusive, so she and her sisters took off for New Mexico when she was 19 and my dad was a little less than 2. On the way she surprise delivered my uncle, who bears little resemblance to my dad. Obviously mom is same. She then very openly carried on an affair with her 60-ish-year-old boss until she met my step-grandpa. He was a great guy, raised my dad and uncle as if they were his own. As the story goes, step-grandpa is overjoyed when grandma gets pregnant with his baby. But my aunt comes out bearing a remarkable resemblance to grandma's boss. Oh. Boss's wife shows up to the happy house with a gun and a checkbook. Says she's using one of the other to get my grandma to go away. So in like 1961 my grandma gets a check for something like $10,000 and she and step-grandpa buy a brand new house. All good, right? Nope, grandma had innumerable more affairs, was married twice more, and my step-grandpa felt so betrayed after he raised all 3 kids he committed suicide. Grandma tried to swoop in and take over his Social Security survivor benefits somehow. Right before Grandma died a few years ago she kicked her last husband out, cleaned out the joint savings, and she and my aunt and cousins took off for Arkansas. Right after I was born my real grandpa shows up on our doorstep with little boxes full of letters, birthday cards, newspaper clippings of my dad's activities like sports and getting his PhD. Grandma had gone through all of them and taken the cash and checks and kept them for herself, and just to be cruel returned the remnants. Turns out Grandpa was a great guy who was never abusive, missed his son like crazy, and was always working blue-collar jobs so could never really get away. Grandma actually bolted when she was 19 because she'd had an affair with a local Buick salesman and his wife came only with a gun. No checkbook. Edit. Wow, this blew up. Little worried to check the comments. I guess to add, my grandma was very sweet to me, and before I knew all the inside drama I just knew her as a very attractive older woman who smoked a lot but otherwise was a pretty typical grandma. She was also a great mother-in-law to my mom, and one of my brothers has severe autism and my grandma was amazing with him. So she's very much a mixed bag depending on who you were in her life. I was a little hurt when she took off for the last time because she cut my dad and his family completely out, and we don't know why. We only heard she died from my great aunt. From the pictures I've seen she was stunningly gorgeous. Had she been born a millennial she'd have made a perfect Instagram influencer, so I think getting men to do her bidding came very natural to her. My grandma had always told me my grandpa's mother died when he was very young and his father couldn't handle him, so that was why he was raised by non-relatives. My sister and I did a little digging and come to find out my great-grandma was only 15 when my grandpa was born, and my great-grandpa was in his late 20s. From what we can tell, her family forced her to marry her abuser. She also didn't die when my grandpa was little, she died when my dad was a teenager. She just took off and left her unhappy situation when grandpa was a kid and never tried to see him again. Then his dad basically left him on the neighbor's porch in the night and took off and had 2 more kids with another significantly younger woman. I think my grandma told us great-grandma had died to make my grandpa seem more sympathetic because he was a mean old bastard and none of his grandkids cared to be around him. My grandpa also continued the cycle of child abandoning. He knocked up his first wife just before he left for military training, and when he got back he said the kid, who she had named after him, wasn't his and kicked them both to the curb. My grandma knew that Junior was his and she used to secretly send the first wife money when she could get away with it without my grandpa knowing. He tried to do the same thing to my grandma when their first child was born, but her family literally held him at gunpoint, so he signed the birth certificate. He claimed both their other kids. My dad was his favorite and the only son he acknowledged, but he always swore my uncle was not his, and none of his kids with my grandma ever met their older half-brother or his kids. My grandma once told me she had hated her husband for almost their entire marriage, but she didn't know what to do besides stay with him. It broke my heart to know she spent so much of her life so unhappy. She is such a sweet woman and didn't deserve the way he treated her. My father raped my 15-year-old sister on my 6th birthday. I had nightmares my entire childhood about her being sent away, seeing my dad arrested, and worse. My mother and aunt covered it up and didn't tell me the truth until I was in my early 20s. Edit 2, protect all children. Thanks for everything, but this is most important. Edit, this got some serious attention already. I appreciate everyone's comments and I've tried to respond. I want to say something about this sister of mine because I've spoken from my POV, but she's at the center of this. When I was 6, I'm sure I adored my mother. But, you know who I remember taking care of me? My oldest sister. She was my favorite person. She read to me about Tom Thumb and sung to me, and I was pretty literally her real live baby doll. When this happened, she disappeared and I didn't know why. When we reconciled, I got to tell her what I remember about her and I got to hug her, but she can never truly understand how I pined for her my entire childhood and how I still do. I'm 46 and she's 55 now. We don't live close and I haven't seen her in 15 years. She won't see this, but I love you, sis. I always have and I always will. I found out that my high school best friend is my cousin. My parents were freaking out when I brought her over. Not as much as when my dad was best friends with her dad in the 70s and his dad panicked because of the resemblance. Turns out Granddad had an affair with her gran around 9 months before he was born. No one in their family knows. And only a handful in ours. Edit, sorry, I wrote that at 1 AM and didn't think anyone would read it. Just want to clarify. So, Granddad has an illegitimate son. Dad's best friend in the 70s was the illegitimate son. Was just coincidence they're best friends. Almost 40 years later I become best friends with Granddad's illegitimate son's daughter. I'm female. We were best friends in the usual sense, nothing else. Haha, I'm British, not from Alabama. No sex with family members. My granddad was just very good at sleeping with other people's wives. This is the only other child we know about though. My parents' cousin was a prostitute in the early 1990s and when she died from STDs in 2000 my mother inherited $9,373 from prostitution. She spent it on raising me ironically. My dad was adopted, but illegally. His birth mother checked into the hospital under my grandmother's name, and then he went home with them instead. My grandfather died before I was born, and my grandma told us the truth a few years before she died. My dad was like 45 when we found out. My great-grandmother supposedly summoned the devil to have my great-grandfather murdered. It's an old urban legend, but if you met her, it might not seem far off considering she's quite the strange old woman and has a voice like that of that little midget lady from Poltergeist but in Spanish. My dad met my mom when he was getting a divorce. She was his divorce lawyer, / We had a murderer/pedophile in our family who murdered 2 little girls after raping them. We only found out after going through newspaper archives in our area. My dad always wondered why no one talked about Uncle John, now they know why. Edit, since a lot of people seem to be viewing this, I'll add some more dark family history. My dad's side is full-blooded Italian. We're related to Benito Mussolini. Also, the guy wasn't Uncle John, I got that wrong. Frank was his name. There's articles in the Detroit newspaper from the 40s about a Libido. Libido was their last name. That was the press nickname for him. Also there was a girl that survived his assault, I believe there was another that died. Edit 2, think I may have misheard info. Reading more about it, it seems he raped and attempted to murder a little girl named Rosalie. She was 7. He slit her throat and she was lucky to survive. Here's some links. The small story is on the very right about the grocer charged with assault. https://newspaperarchive.com/South Haven Daily Tribune February 01 1946 p1/https://www. Newspapers.com/newspage/992000289/ Sorry about the paywall. I signed up for a free trial to view this, took screenshots and deleted my free trial. In the 40s my great-grandma was a number cruncher and my grandma was a runner. They have an article or two with an unnamed 16-year-old girl. It was my dad's mum. My dad's sister lives in an old mafia house, and would have the mob visit her every few months because the house had stuff buried in the backyard and my aunt loved the house and refused to sell it to them. One day they came and dug up 2 tiny coffins in the backyard. They left her alone after that. She said there were false walls, a hidden attic, and strange wires everywhere. They renovated it all. I overheard this story but don't know the context. A man owes the mafia like $10K, they said next time they come and he doesn't have it they were gonna kill him. He had it all in a burlap sack on top of the heater. The top of the heater got really hot when it was turned on. The wife's mom was cold and complaining, so they turned the heater on, not realizing the money was on top of the heater. It burst into flames and burned up. The mob came for him again. They said it just got burned up and that he'd get it again. The mob thought he was lying, so they took him to the backyard and shot him between the eyes and left. Edit 3 Imager links to the screenshots I took. Sorry, they're not cropped. I took like 60 shots of them cause it was slow to load and stuff. I'll try to crop and repost them again, but right now bear with me. Embarrassed smiley face. https://imager.com/a/imager.com/a/1 My mother is batshit crazy. Her sisters know but just go on as if she doesn't really exist. None of us see her. She sometimes calls her younger sister to whine about her boyfriend. She'll be 77 soon, the guy is 50. They all ignored the fact that I was being severely neglected, that she was going through boyfriends at a rapid rate. Every single one was an alcoholic/addict and abusive as hell. I once asked my aunt through email if they had ever tried to do anything. Did anybody call social services, or even talk about doing it? She emailed back, I wish you luck in your search. My grandfather was running an illegal abortion clinic in his apartment. He was living alone at that time. The scariest part is that he had zero experience and he was definitely not a doctor. I know he did prison for that, but I don't know how many years. What the fuck is wrong with the grandparents here? I've been waiting for this thread cause I just found this out over Christmas! Dad's ex-wife had 2 kids from her previous marriage. One of them, the younger one, was born deaf because her ex-husband shoved her down the stairs during pregnancy. Came to find out that he did not do that. He was the nicest man ever. She lied because the deaf kid is actually her cousin's. She fucked her cousin when he was staying at their house for a bit and had an inbred kid with health defects. She hid this from her husband. This all came to light when the older brother, born from her husband, no health defects, told his dad that he accidentally walked in on mom banging the cousin. Dad got a paternity test. Confirmed it. Deaf brother still doesn't know. Praying no one buys him a 23andMe for Christmas ever. I'm pretty sure my uncle was in the Hells Angels, or at least affiliated with them. His funeral was interesting. The procession to the cemetery was loud and proud. Edit, I'll give a little more detail about him for you guys since this thread got so popular. I've been told he was a great mechanic even in his teenage years. There's a story of how he took a car completely apart and all the parts were laying around my grandmother's backyard. Grandma told him that she would give him $100 if he could put it back together again and get it running, and he did. Also, that would have been the late 60s, early 70s, so $100 was worth a little bit more back then. He even had his own repair shop at one point. He was a motorcycle drag racer, and quite popular with the ladies. At his funeral there was a line of ex-girlfriends that came to cry over him. All of my uncles were bikers, but I think he's the only one that became an outlaw type. I guess you could say he was the black sheep of the family. However, he was loved by everyone. I only really saw him on holidays and I was only 12 when he passed away, so I didn't really get to know him personally. My mother would tell me stories of how he would pester her to no end when they were kids. He would hide under her bed until she fell asleep and yank her off the bed. Then other times he would hide outside her bedroom window and shoot her with his BB gun. My dad has a secret kid that he never talks about. And his name is Chris, and he lives in Ontario, and me and my other brothers have no idea how to find him. That one cousin isn't actually your cousin. Your aunt was pregnant by another man and your uncle knew, and married your aunt anyway so her family wouldn't disown her. She looks like a thumb and is dumber than a bag of hammers. My mother's side, Cubans, were majority owners of La Tropicana, Cuban nightclub, back in the 50s and 60s in Cuba. They were very much involved with the Cuban mafia. Not really dark exactly, but a great uncle of mine was on his deathbed with my grandpa and young dad in the room. Apparently at some point after the nurse left, grandpa closed the door and said, "So, who are you anyway?" As it turned out, my real great uncle came to the US in the 40s 50s, got his citizenship, and then promptly decided he didn't like the US as much as Italy, so he went back home. One of his friends said, "Since you don't intend to ever return to the US, would it be alright if I just used your papers?" And the guy said yes. So for probably 2/3 yards of his life he lived in the US using my great uncle's identity. All my grandpa knew was that this man was definitely not related to us, but as his own father accepted the guy and treated him well, so did grandpa. My grandfather on my mom's side was a pretty shit person. After he married my grandmother, he brought another girl home, and basically told my grandmother that the girl was part of their relationship, whether she liked it or not. My grandmother then realized she was lesbian and fell in love with the girl. They both left my grandfather and ran away together. My family knows what happened with the Skidmore, Missouri murder. Great-grandpa was a Nazi, relatively high-ranking apparently. My grandpa actually grew up in Nazi Germany, was part of the Hitler Youth and all that. Grandpa says that my great-grandpa spoke out against the Nazi regime, so he was demoted and put on the front lines where he was killed. None of us are sure if that's true or if it's his way of covering up what really happened. He never likes talking about his childhood much, so we probably won't ever know. Supposedly my great-grandfather deserted his post on a ship with another guy in Washington. He was in the Spanish-American War and was fed up with the rations. They jumped over and swam to shore, and when they got to shore and were deciding what to do, the boiler blew. He claimed to have not been responsible for the boiler. Then he stole a bicycle and biked back east. I think this is all a tall tale. I tried looking it up and verifying it and didn't really come up with anything credible. My uncle was a lawyer for the mob in a South American country, and a pistol used to murder a Supreme Court judge was found buried in his backyard. My oldest cousin has a kid with another woman that is not his wife. My first cousin is a porn star. My friends find it hilarious. No, I won't say who. Yes, I found out that way, by stumbling across her on a video. Bootleggers, shot some folks, hung some folks, lost some folks, found some folks, incest. A lot of shit. Edit, nope, we weren't racist at all. Mainly white on white criminal violence. Not mine per se. My birth mom has a whole different family. They don't know anything about my sister and I also. My birth mom's sister had a threesome with two 15-year-olds and is now a registered sex offender. My dad's mother was a prostitute and all-around terrible lady. My grandfather was totally dominated by her and allowed it to happen, while he was miserable, because they had 13 kids. The final straw for him was when she brought a black man home. Big deal in the 1950s. I guess he walked into the room where they were having sex, stood over them, and blew his brains out. I found out about this a few years ago while my mom was trying to explain to me why my father was sick a piece of shit. That my aunt and uncle are really father and daughter living together in an incest relationship. My great-great-great-grandfather was the second Mormon ever, and personally converted Brigham Young to Mormonism. I'm sorry. My mother is light-skinned because my grandma was raped by a white man. I found out at my grandma's wake. We had always been told we were part Native American. Reading this thread really makes me grateful for my family, however flawed they are. My great-grandfather's second wife had an affair with her stepson. My dad faked his own death in an attempt to get back at my mom for cheating on him. He had a note posted outside the bedroom door that said, "Do not let Karsten me in," and from there it's history. Mom walked in and immediately began screaming. I walked in behind her and saw nothing but blood, my dad, and a shotgun. Mom grabbed me and ran us over to the neighbors where she called the cops. Look up the Franklin Township creeper, his name is Weston Gray. He's my second cousin. I can't remember all of what he did, but it shook the family. His wife divorced him and now he's broke with a gambling problem. Yikes lol. Edit, holy crap, this is the first time I've gotten over 10 upvotes lol. Thank you everyone. My great-great-great-grandfather, Mike, was a complete psycho. He and his wife, Mary, had 10 kids, 9 girls and a boy. While she was pregnant with their 11th, he kicked her and broke her back while they were outside in the middle of winter. He went inside and left her lying out there all night. The baby was born during the night and froze to death. Mary was bedridden for the rest of her life. Mike took this opportunity to begin sexually abusing 6 of their daughters. The 2 oldest were already grown and had left home, and the youngest was just a baby. This went on for 4 years, until he decided the youngest was old enough to start on. One of the other girls, 19-year-old Ida, stepped in to defend her. He told Ida that she could save her sister by satisfying him herself. Afterward, Ida told her mother, who refused to believe it and slapped her. Mike punished Ida for telling by making her brother and sisters each stab her 1 time. A nun had heard about a local farmer with a crippled wife and 7 children. By this time the 3rd oldest girl had left, and decided she should go out and see if there was anything she could do to help them out. She visited while Ida was still recovering from being stabbed and noticed that the children were very clearly being abused. She helped all the girls who were being raped get away by finding them jobs that offered room and board, leaving only the boy and youngest girl. In retaliation, Mike had the nun murdered and the body dumped in the river. My Gigi grandma tried to tell people her father was behind the disappearance, but he was well connected and admired. He was an extremely talented musician and knew Ulysses S. Grant personally, and she was just a 9-year-old girl, and nobody would listen to her. All of this was kept quiet because it was embarrassing and scandalous. Most of the siblings never told anyone. Ida explained the scars to her husband and children by saying she had had surgery for tumors. Very few know the truth. TLDR, my GGG grandpa crippled his wife, killed their baby, raped their daughters, had one of the kids stabbed by the rest, had an unkilled, and pretty much got away with it all. Edit, there were 10 kids, not 7 as I originally wrote. My parents had a kid outside of wedlock and then put him up for adoption. This might not seem super dark, but to a Christian 15-year-old boy it shattered my reality. I think about him almost every day, knowing that I have a brother out there that I've never, and might never meet. We kept slaves till 1892. Bootleggers during Prohibition, apparently. Both sides. Not incredibly dark, but pretty interesting to find out. Either way, they take alcohol very seriously. Molestation is the generational curse. Only one of the grandkids has reproduced yet, so there hasn't really been time for it to happen yet. My grandma was raped by her sister, her husband molested 3 of their 5 daughters, my mom included, and it had happened to at least 9 of us grandkids, myself included, and those are the ones I know about. My druggy uncle shacked up with some woman who ended up with custody of them after they split. She would tie up their 3 boys and stuff them in a closet so she could get high, and other days she'd force them to watch her and her boyfriends have sex. Some of them would rape the boys. The youngest one cut up his arm by breaking out a window to go to 7-Eleven and steal milk for his brothers. The clerk called the cops and they were rescued. My uncle got custody of them and moved them across the country to live with my grandma. All 3 of them molested every kid they could get their hands on, including me. One is a homeless loser, the one who molested me works at Burger King and mooches off his sister, and his younger brother is a burnout. I hope it stops with the next generation, but I doubt it in this family. Paternal grandfather was incredibly abusive, to the point of permanently fucking up some of my family members mentally. Aunt was a prostitute. Cousin C is schizophrenic and it's because of abuse and drugs, so we've been told. My great X3 grandfather fought for both the North and South during the Civil War. He was originally rebel-roused to fight for the South and abandoned his troop the first chance he could get. About 2 years after escaping to Illinois, he joined up with the infantry to fight. Right before the end of the war, his group was ambushed and held captive in a burned-out plantation. They were only fed real food once a week, and my grandfather got an infection in his leg and almost went blind in captivity. One day the guards just left and they made their escape. He eventually changed our last name because the main thing that scared him was being recognized as a Confederate deserter, even though he didn't want to fight in the war. I'm going back to the why do you like your crush post. I have an uncle who's lived his entire life in an institution. When my grandfather died, the obituary didn't mention his existence, only my father and his twin sister were listed as children. Edit, he has the mental capacity of about a 3-year-old. My grandfather visited him every week, and after he died my father took that over. He's always been well cared for, it's just something nobody ever talks about. It was simply understood that when my grandfather died the story would be father of 2 instead of 3. My father's mother had mental illness. She was given a bunch of crazy drugs that probably caused her first son's severe mental impairment, and a couple years later when she had twins my father had a cleft palate, not visibly disfiguring, but it took him a long time to learn to talk properly, also likely caused by the drugs, which from my understanding didn't really do anything except sedate her. When my father and his sister were 12, their mother took her life, and my grandfather was wholly unequipped for life as a single father, while her side of the family basically just vanished after she died and never bothered to even check in to see if her kids were okay. A year later my grandfather remarried a wonderful woman, who I always considered my grandmother. I was 5 or 6 before I found out she was technically my step-grandmother, whose own kids had already grown up and moved out. She took charge and saved the family from oblivion, treating my father and his sister like they were her own kids, so it was a mostly happy ending to a sad story. But the living reminder of the worst times was simply never mentioned in conversation, ever. The obituary read, devoted father to X and Y, loving stepfather to A and B and grandfather to, without any acknowledgement of his oldest son's existence.